What if the real reason was deeper, buried in factories and finances, in moral choices and political contradictions, in a system that was already collapsing from within? This wasn't just a war of North versus South. It was a war between two futures, one powered by industry, railroads, and modern warfare. The other anchored to an old order that could not survive the new world rising around it. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you won't just understand how the South lost. You'll understand why it was almost inevitable. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share your deepest now in the comments below. Ladies and gentlemen, history is not only written in ink. It is written in blood, in broken families, in silent fields where cannons once thundered, and in the quiet choices of leaders who believed they were shaping destiny. When we ask why the South lost the American Civil War, we are not merely counting casualties or tallying battles. We are confronting a deeper question about power, about principle, about people, and about the peril of building a nation on an idea that denies humanity itself. The war began in 1861 with confidence ringing through Southern streets. Crowds cheered as young men marched away in gray uniforms. Many believed the Confederacy would win quickly. They trusted in their generals, in their courage, in what they saw as divine favor. They believed cotton, that soft white fiber woven into the fabric of the global economy, would guarantee European support. King Cotton, they called it, as if it were royalty that would command the loyalty of nations like Britain and France. But history is rarely so obedient. At first glance, the reasons for the South's defeat appear straightforward. The Union had more people, nearly 22 million to the Confederacy's 9 million, and of those 9 million, almost 4 million were enslaved and held in bondage. The North had more factories, more railroads, more ships, more money. It had the capacity to produce rifles, uniforms, boots, and bullets in staggering quantities. Yet wars are not won by arithmetic alone. The South possessed extraordinary military leadership. Men like Robert E. Lee inspired fierce loyalty. His Army of Northern Virginia fought with skill and audacity, often defeating larger Union forces. Early victories at places like Battle of Bull Run stunned the North and fueled Southern hope. For a time, it seemed possible that courage might compensate for scarcity. But courage cannot fill empty stomachs. As the war dragged on, the Union's advantages hardened into inevitabilities. Under leaders like Abraham Lincoln, the North transformed its industrial might into a weapon. Railroads carried troops swiftly across vast distances. Factories worked day and night. Shipyards launched ironclads. The Union blockade, an unrelenting naval stranglehold, slowly suffocated Southern trade. Cotton piled up on Southern docks while supplies dwindled. The world did not come to rescue the Confederacy. And there was another force at work, quieter, but just as decisive. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. At first glance, it seemed limited. It did not free every enslaved person overnight, but it changed the moral architecture of the war. The conflict was no longer merely about Union or secession. It became a struggle over slavery itself, over whether a republic conceived in liberty could endure half slave and half free. With that proclamation, the Confederacy lost something it could never reclaim: moral ambiguity on the world stage. Britain and France, both having abolished slavery, could not easily align themselves with a government fighting to preserve it. And then, in one of history's profound ironies, the very people the Confederacy sought to keep enslaved began to undermine it from within. Enslaved men and women fled plantations, weakening the Southern labor force. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers would eventually fight for the Union. They wore blue uniforms and carried muskets not just for victory, but for freedom, their own and their children's. The South was fighting to preserve a social order rooted in bondage. The North increasingly was fighting to end it. Even on the battlefield, the tide turned. At Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863, Lee's invasion of the North was repelled after 3 brutal days. Pickett's charge, that desperate assault across open fields, ended in devastating loss. It was not merely a tactical defeat. It was a psychological one. The Confederacy would never again carry the war so deeply into Union territory. Meanwhile, in the West, Union General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, splitting the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River. The Union was not just winning battles, it was dismantling the Confederacy's geographic spine. But perhaps the most revealing reason for the South's defeat lay within its own philosophy. The Confederacy was founded on the principle of states' rights, on suspicion of centralized authority. Yet war requires coordination, taxation, national strategy, and strong central leadership. In fighting to preserve local autonomy, the Southern government often struggled to impose the very unity required for survival. Governors resisted Richmond's authority. Supplies were hoarded. Inflation spiraled. Bread riots erupted. In Southern cities, as women demanded food for their starving children, the South faced not only Northern armies but internal fractures. And beneath all of it was the central contradiction. A society built on human bondage was trying to defend liberty for itself. That contradiction carried strategic consequences. Enslaved labor was essential to the Southern economy and war effort. Yet maintaining slavery tied down troops, distorted priorities, and alienated potential allies. The Confederacy could not fully mobilize its entire population without undermining the very institution it sought to protect. In the end, by April 1865, the outcome was no longer in doubt. At Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. The war that had consumed more than 600,000 lives, perhaps more, was over. The South did not lose solely because it was outnumbered. It did not lose solely because it lost battles or blockaded ports. It lost because it waged war against the currents of economic reality, demographic strength, industrial power, and increasingly, moral conviction. It lost because the modern world, with its factories and railroads and mass armies, favored scale and coordination over valor alone. And it lost because history, in its long and uneven march, bends away from systems that deny human dignity. The tragedy of the Civil War is not only that brothers fought brothers. It is that so much suffering was required to resolve a question that had haunted the nation since its founding: whether a country dedicated to liberty could tolerate slavery. The Confederacy gambled that it could carve out a future by preserving the past. It believed that courage and cotton would outweigh industry and idealism. It believed that its cause could endure on the strength of tradition. But tradition cannot outlast transformation. In the quiet that followed the cannons, the fields of Virgin, EA and Tennessee returned to stillness. The gray uniforms were folded away. The banners were lowered. A nation scarred but unbroken faced the immense task of rebuilding, not just roads and railways, but its very definition of freedom. The real reason the South lost the Civil War was not a single battle or a single decision. It was the collision between a fading order and a rising one, between a society rooted in slavery and a nation struggling, however imperfectly, toward a broader promise of liberty. And in that collision, history chose its course. When the guns first thundered in 1861, many in the South believed the coming conflict would be brief and decisive. Confidence flowed through cities and countryside alike. The Confederacy possessed gifted generals, a proud martial tradition, and a population fiercely committed to its cause. Yet beneath that confidence lay a reality far less romantic and far more consequential. The modern world was tilting toward industrial power, and that world belonged overwhelmingly to the North. The Union entered the war with nearly 22 million people. The Confederacy, by contrast, had roughly 9 million, and nearly 4 million of them were enslaved, held in bondage, and excluded from civic participation. Numbers alone do not determine victory, but they shape endurance. War, especially a prolonged war, is a test not only of courage but of capacity, the ability to replace losses, to sustain armies, to absorb shock. The North could replenish its ranks year after year. The South could not do so without scraping ever deeper into a shrinking reservoir of manpower. Beyond population, the disparity in industrial strength was staggering. By 1860, the vast majority of the nation's factories were located in the North. Ironworks, textile mills, foundries, machine shops, they hummed across states like Pennsylvania, New York, and Massachusetts. The Confederacy remained largely agrarian, its wealth tied to land and crops rather than machinery and manufacturing. Cotton was abundant, but rifles and railroad engines were not. The Union could manufacture thousands of muskets, artillery pieces, uniforms, boots, and railway cars with industrial efficiency. The Confederacy often struggled to equip its soldiers consistently, relying on captured supplies or limited domestic production. Railroads became arteries of war. The North possessed a far denser and more integrated rail network, allowing troops and supplies to move swiftly across vast distances. A Union regiment could be transported from one theater of war to another with relative speed, reinforcing threatened positions or exploiting victories. Southern rail lines, fewer and less standardized, were not built for sustained military coordination. Tracks often used different gauges, making seamless transport difficult. As the war dragged on and rails wore down under heavy use, the Confederacy lacked the industrial base to replace them efficiently. The breakdown of rail infrastructure gradually crippled its ability to feed armies and transport reinforcements. Financial power compounded these advantages. The Union had established banking systems, access to international credit, and the capacity to issue bonds that found buyers both domestically and abroad. The Confederacy, lacking a robust financial infrastructure, leaned heavily on printing paper money. Inflation soared. The value of Confederate currency plummeted as the war continued. A soldier's pay could scarcely purchase basic necessities. Families at home faced skyrocketing prices for food and clothing. Bread riots erupted in southern cities, a stark reminder that war is fought not only on battlefields but in kitchens and marketplaces. Control of the seas proved equally decisive. The Union Navy, far larger at the outset and rapidly expanding, enforced a blockade along thousands of miles of southern coastline. This strategy, part of a broader plan to strangle the Confederacy economically, limited the export of cotton and the import of war material. Southern leaders had hoped that European dependence on cotton would compel nations like Britain and France to intervene or at least break the blockade. Instead, European powers diversified their cotton sources, turning to Egypt and India. The anticipated diplomatic leverage never fully materialized. The blockade tightened like a vice, restricting trade and depleting resources over time. Industrial capacity also meant technological adaptation. Northern foundries produced ironclad warships that transformed naval warfare. Factories turned out repeating rifles and advanced artillery in growing numbers. Telegraph lines stretched across Union territory, enabling rapid communication between commanders and political leaders. Information could travel faster than ever before, allowing coordinated strategies across multiple fronts. The Confederacy, though innovative in moments, lacked the industrial scale to match this sustained technological evolution. Manpower, industry, transportation, finance, naval dominance, these elements formed a web of structural strength. They did not guarantee immediate triumph. Early in the war, Confederate forces achieved notable victories, and Southern generals demonstrated tactical brilliance. But as months turned into years, the underlying imbalance grew more pronounced. The Union could absorb defeats that would have been catastrophic for the South. When a Union army suffered heavy casualties, new recruits eventually filled its ranks. When Southern armies suffered similar losses, the recovery was slower, thinner, more fragile. The agricultural foundation of the Southern economy further complicated its woe. Our effort. Plantations prioritized cash crops, especially cotton, over diversified food production. As Union forces advanced and enslaved laborers escaped or were liberated, agricultural output faltered. Armies require consistent food supplies, and civilians require sustenance to maintain morale. Shortages spread, malnutrition weakened both soldiers and civilians. Meanwhile, northern farms, increasingly mechanized and supported by rail transport, continued to produce abundant grain and livestock, feeding both the population and the armies in the field. Industrial warfare is cumulative. It is not merely the clash of regiments in a single engagement, but the steady grinding down of capacity. Each cannon forged in a northern foundry represented not only a weapon, but the existence of a system capable of producing thousands more. Each mile of functioning railroad signified an infrastructure resilient enough to sustain pressure. Each successful bond sale reflected confidence in the Union's durability. Over time, these structural advantages accumulated like compound interest, widening the gap between the two sides. Leadership in Washington recognized the significance of this material superiority. Strategies evolved to leverage it fully, coordinating multiple armies and sustaining simultaneous offensives. The Union's ability to wage war on several fronts at once, in Virginia and Tennessee, along the Mississippi River, stretched Confederate resources thin. Southern forces, already limited, were compelled to defend vast territories with diminishing means. The war became not only a contest of valor, but a test of endurance shaped by economic and industrial foundations laid decades before the first shot was fired. The North's embrace of industrialization, urban growth, and diversified finance had quietly prepared it for a kind of conflict that demanded scale. The South's realia. Nunts on an agricultural export economy deeply intertwined with slavery left it vulnerable in a prolonged struggle requiring manufacturing depth and logistical resilience. As the conflict lengthened, the disparity in boots, bullets, rails, ships, and currency translated into a slow constriction. The Confederacy fought with determination, often with extraordinary bravery, but bravery could not manufacture locomotives or stabilize a collapsing currency. It could not reopen blockaded ports or conjure factories where none existed. The industrial age had arrived on the battlefield, and it favored the side that had built the machinery of modernity long before war made its demands unavoidable. In the early months of the Civil War, the conflict was framed especially by the North as a struggle to preserve the Union. It was about secession, about constitutional order, about whether a republic could survive internal fracture. Many in the North who opposed slavery nonetheless fought not to abolish it, but to keep the nation intact. This distinction mattered deeply, not only for domestic unity, but for how the war was perceived beyond American shores. The Confederacy hoped that as long as the war remained a political dispute between two sections, foreign powers might recognize Southern independence. But in 1863, that calculation changed in a single transformative stroke. When Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, the character of the war shifted from a fight solely for national preservation to a moral crusade against slavery. The proclamation declared that enslaved people in territories still in rebellion shall be thenceforward, and forever free, though it did not immediately free all enslaved individuals. Its reach was limited to areas outside Union control. Its symbolic and strategic impact was immense. The war was no longer politically ambiguous. It became unmistakably a struggle over human bondage. This transformation reshaped international diplomacy. Great Britain and France had economic reasons to consider supporting the Confederacy. Southern cotton fed British textile mills, and European leaders watched the conflict with interest. Yet both Britain and France had abolished slavery decades earlier. Public opinion in those nations was strongly anti-slavery. By redefining the war as a battle against the institution of slavery, Lincoln made it politically and morally perilous for European governments to align themselves with a slaveholding republic. Any move toward recognizing the Confederacy would have appeared as an endorsement of slavery itself, a position incompatible with prevailing European sentiment. The Confederacy's hope for foreign recognition dimmed significantly after 1863. Its leaders had believed that King Cotton would compel intervention. Instead, the Emancipation Proclamation reframed the war in moral terms that transcended economics. European workers, particularly in Britain, endured cotton shortages but still expressed solidarity with the Union cause. The Confederacy found itself increasingly isolated on the world stage, its diplomatic leverage weakened by the moral clarity the proclamation provided. The shift also altered the internal dynamics of the war. Enslaved people across the South heard of the proclamation through word of mouth, Union soldiers, and clandestine networks of communication. For many, it was a signal, imperfect, delayed, but powerful, that the advancing Union armies represented liberation. As Union forces moved deeper into Confederate territory, enslaved men and women fled plantations in growing numbers. Their departures disrupted the Southern labor system, undermining agricultural production and weakening the economic backbone of the Confederacy. The act of escape itself became a form of resistance, transforming the enslaved population from a coerced labor force into active participants in the Confederacy's destabilization. The proclamation also authorized the enlistment of black men into the Union Army and Navy. This decision carried profound military consequences. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers would eventually serve in the Union forces, along with thousands more in naval service. Their contributions bolstered Union manpower at a critical juncture in the war. They garrisoned forts, guarded supply lines, and fought in major battles. Their presence symbolized the evolving purpose of the conflict, men who had been denied freedom now bearing arms to secure it. The Confederacy, built upon the foundation of slavery, could not easily replicate such a mobilization without dismantling its own ideological core. The moral redefinition of the war strengthened Northern resolve. For many citizens, especially abolitionists who had long criticized the federal government's caution, the proclamation represented a fulfillment of principle. It infused the Union cause with renewed meaning. Soldiers who had initially enlisted to preserve the nation increasingly understood their sacrifices as part of a larger struggle for human dignity. The narrative of the war expanded beyond constitutional debate into the realm of fundamental rights. Lincoln's decision was neither impulsive nor purely sentimental. It was shaped by military necessity and political calculation. He understood that emancipation would weaken the Confederacy economically and socially while strengthening the Union militarily and diplomatically. Yet he also recognized the moral weight of the moment. The United States, founded on ideals of liberty, had long been burdened by the contradiction of slavery. By tying the Union's survival to emancipation, Lincoln aligned this nation's war aims with its founding rhetoric, narrowing the gap between principle and practice. The proclamation did not end slavery immediately, nor did it eliminate racial prejudice in the North. It was a wartime measure grounded in executive authority as commander-in-chief. Its permanence would depend on constitutional amendment. But its issuance marked a turning point in perception and purpose. It signaled that the federal government was willing to strike at the heart of the Confederacy's social and economic system. On the battlefield, the knowledge that Union victory now meant emancipation intensified the stakes. Confederate soldiers understood that defeat would not merely restore the Union, but dismantle the institutions central to Southern society. This realization hardened resistance in some quarters, yet it also underscored the existential nature of the conflict. The South was fighting not only for political independence, but for the preservation of slavery itself. The Emancipation Proclamation altered the moral terrain upon which the war was fought. It reframed the conflict in terms that resonated beyond America's borders and beyond immediate military calculations. It denied the Confederacy the cloak of moral ambiguity and deprived it of potential allies. It transformed enslaved individuals into agents of change and reinforced the Union's capacity with new soldiers and renewed conviction. The war, once argued in the language of federalism and sovereignty, now stood plainly before the world as a contest over freedom and bondage, a reckoning with the nation's deepest contradiction. A declaration that the preservation of the Union and the destruction of slavery had become inseparable in purpose and destiny. By the summer of 1863, the Civil War had already consumed 2 brutal years. Towns had been shattered, families divided, and thousands of young men buried, far from home. The Confederacy had demonstrated resilience beyond what many in the North expected. Victories in Virginia had bolstered Southern morale, and the leadership of Robert E. Lee inspired confidence that boldness and tactical brilliance might offset material disadvantage. Yet wars often hinge not only on courage or command, but on moments when momentum shifts decisively. In July 1863, 2 such moments unfolded almost simultaneously, at Battle of Gettysburg and Siege of Vicksburg, altering the trajectory of the conflict in ways from which the Confederacy would never fully recover. Lee's decision to invade the North in the summer of 1863 was driven by strategic necessity and opportunity. Virginia had endured repeated campaigns, its farmland scarred and resources strained. By carrying the war into Pennsylvania, Lee hoped to relieve pressure on Southern soil, disrupt Northern industry, and perhaps secure a victory so dramatic that it would influence Northern public opinion and foreign governments. A triumph on Union territory might have strengthened the peace movement in the North and revived Confederate hopes for international recognition. The armies collided near the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in early July. What began as a chance encounter escalated into 3 days of relentless combat. Fields, ridges, and orchards became killing grounds. Soldiers fought across Cemetery Ridge, Little Round Top, and the wheat field, each location etched into the nation's memory by bloodshed. The scale of casualties was staggering. By the battle's end, more than 50,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, making it one of the bloodiest engagements in American history. On the 3rd day, Lee ordered a massive assault against the center of the Union line, a charge across open ground toward entrenched positions. Known as Pickett's Charge, it was an act of daring hat bordered on desperation. Confederate soldiers advanced under withering artillery and rifle fire, their ranks thinning with every step. For a brief, harrowing moment, some reached the Union line, but the assault collapsed. Survivors retreated across the same exposed fields, leaving behind fallen comrades and shattered formations. Gettysburg marked more than a tactical defeat. It ended Lee's northern invasion and forced the Army of Northern Virginia into retreat. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Confederate forces dimmed. The psychological blow was profound. Southern hopes of dictating terms on Union soil faded. Northern morale, shaken by earlier setbacks, found renewed strength in the defense of home territory. The victory demonstrated that Confederate offensives could be repelled decisively. While the guns thundered in Pennsylvania, another struggle unfolded along the Mississippi River. Control of that river had been a central objective for the Union from the war's outset. The Mississippi was the nation's great artery, stretching from Minnesota to the Gulf of Mexico. For the Confederacy, it was a lifeline connecting eastern and western states, facilitating the movement of troops, cattle, and supplies. If severed, the Confederacy would be physically divided. Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, a fortress perched on high bluffs overlooking the river. The campaign was arduous, involving complex maneuvers, river crossings, and relentless engagements. By May 1863, Grant's army had encircled the city. What followed was weeks of siege warfare. Bombardments rained down on defenders, civilians sheltered in caves carved into hillsides. Food supplies dwindled. Disease spread. On July 4, 1863, One day after the Confederate retreat from Gettysburg began, Vicksburg surrendered. With its fall, the Union gained control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was split in two states west of the river. Texas, Arkansas, and parts of Louisiana were effectively cut off from the Eastern Confederacy. The flow of resources became increasingly strained. The strategic geography of the South, already challenged by limited infrastructure, grew more fragmented. The twin outcomes of Gettysburg and Vicksburg transformed the war's strategic landscape. Gettysburg halted Confederate momentum in the East, while Vicksburg secured Union dominance in the West. Together, they signaled that the Confederacy could no longer sustain expansive offensives or rely on geographic cohesion. The Union, by contrast, demonstrated an ability to coordinate large-scale operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. These turning points also reshaped political calculations. In the North, news of the victories bolstered support for continuing the war. Critics who had doubted the Union's prospects faced the reality of tangible progress. The successes strengthened the administration's credibility and reinforced public commitment. In the South, the losses deepened hardship and uncertainty. Confidence that foreign intervention might alter the balance further receded. The strategic implications were cumulative. After Gettysburg, Lee's army remained formidable but increasingly confined to defensive operations. After Vicksburg, the Confederacy struggled to move men and material efficiently across its divided territory. The Mississippi River became a Union highway, facilitating further campaigns into the southern interior. The war began to shift from Confederate initiative to Union persistence. The significance of these battles lay not merely in casualties or captured territory, but in momentum. Wars often hinge on perception, on belief in eventual victory. Before July 1863, the Confederacy could imagine achieving independence through decisive blows and sustained resistance. After those twin defeats, the horizon narrowed. The Union's industrial and numerical advantages, already substantial, were now paired with strategic dominance in key regions. Gettysburg and Vicksburg did not end the war. Fierce fighting would continue for nearly 2 more years. Lives would continue to be lost in staggering numbers. But July 1863 marked a hinge in the conflict's narrative arc. The Confederacy's high water mark had been reached and passed. The tide, once uncertain, began to flow steadily in one direction, reshaping battlefields, political landscapes, and the very geography of the divided nation. From its birth, the Confederacy carried within it a paradox. It had seceded in the name of states' rights, asserting that sovereign states possessed the authority to withdraw from a federal union they believed no longer protected their interests. Suspicion of centralized power was not a peripheral belief. It was foundational. Yet war, especially modern war, demands concentration of authority. It requires taxation, conscription, coordination of resources, unified strategy, and the ability to compel compliance across vast territories. The Confederacy found itself caught between ideology and necessity, and that tension weakened its capacity to wage sustained conflict. The Confederate Constitution closely resembled that of the United States, but it reflected an explicit emphasis on state sovereignty. Leaders in Richmond were cautious about imposing policies that might resemble the federal overreach they had rebelled against. This caution created friction when the demands of war intensified. Governors guarded their prerogatives, often resisting directives from the central government. Militia units were sometimes retained for local defense rather than integrated into broader national strategy. The result was a fragmented approach to mobilization, one that hindered efficient deployment of manpower. Conscription illustrated the dilemma. As casualties mounted and voluntary enlistments declined, the Confederate government instituted one of the first national drafts in American history. It was a dramatic assertion of central authority, and it provoked controversy. Some citizens saw it as a betrayal of the very principles for which secession had been justified. Exemptions, including those that allowed certain slaveholders to avoid service under the so-called 20 Negro Law, fueled resentment among poorer whites who felt the burdens of war were not equally shared. Internal divisions deepened as the strain of prolonged conflict exposed class tensions within Southern society. Economic management posed another challenge. The Confederacy lacked a mature financial infrastructure and struggled to coordinate fiscal policy across states. Efforts to impose taxes met resistance. Rather than relying primarily on taxation, the government printed paper currency in increasing quantities. Inflation surged, prices for basic goods skyrocketed, eroding civilian morale. Women in cities such as Richmond protested food shortages and bread riots that revealed the desperation simmering beneath public expressions of loyalty. The inability to stabilize the economy undermined confidence in the central government's competence. Transportation and logistics further highlighted the limits of coordination. Railroads, though critical to moving troops and supplies, were owned by various private companies and subject to differing state regulations. Efforts by the Confederate government to standardize and control rail use were often delayed or contested. Without a unified system of maintenance and replacement, tracks deteriorated under the strain of wartime demands. Shortages of iron and skilled labor compounded the problem. The absence of strong central oversight left infrastructure vulnerable at the very moment it needed reinforcement. The tension between local loyalty and national identity also affected strategic decisions. Many soldiers identified primarily with their home states. Regiments were often organized by locality, reinforcing bonds of community but also fostering parochialism. When threats arose near home, pressure mounted to redeploy troops for local defense rather than maintain concentration in critical theaters. Governors sometimes resisted transferring forces out of their states, fearing vulnerability. This diffusion of military strength complicated efforts to mass armies at decisive points. Political dissent within the South added to the strain. Regions such as eastern Tennessee and parts of North Carolina contained significant Unionist sentiment. In some areas, guerrilla warfare and internal conflict erupted. The Confederate government faced not only external invasion, but pockets of internal opposition. Suppressing dissent required manpower and attention that might otherwise have been directed toward confronting Union armies. The promise of unity that had accompanied secession proved more fragile under the weight of war's hardships. Leadership in Richmond, including President Jefferson Davis, grappled constantly with the balance between principle and practicality. Davis understood the necessity of centralized authority in wartime, yet his assertiveness often alienated governors and legislators. Disputes over appointments, strategy, and resource allocation eroded political cohesion. Unlike the Union, which increasingly consolidated power under federal direction, the Confederacy struggled to cultivate a stable consensus around national authority. The institution of slavery itself intensified internal contradictions. Enslaved labor formed the backbone of the Southern economy, yet reliance on that system constrained mobilization. Large numbers of white men were needed at the front, but plantations required oversight. Fear of slave uprisings lingered, especially as Union forces advanced. The Confederate government hesitated to arm enslaved men until the final desperate months of the war, recognizing that such a move would challenge the ideological foundation of the state. Debates over whether to enlist enslaved individuals in exchange for freedom revealed deep divisions and underscored the extent to which principle conflicted with survival. As the war dragged on, fatigue magnified every structural weakness. Shortages of food and clothing eroded morale among soldiers and civilians alike. Desertion rates climbed. Families at home struggling under inflation and scarcity urged loved ones to return. The Confederate government attempted to enforce discipline, but enforcement itself required administrative capacity that was often stretched thin. The social fabric frayed under the combined pressures of military defeat, economic collapse, and political discord. The Confederacy had sought independence to preserve a particular vision of liberty rooted in local control and social hierarchy. Yet the necessities of war demanded the very centralization and national discipline that its founding philosophy distrusted. Each assertion of central authority risked undermining ideological legitimacy. Each hesitation to assert control weakened practical effectiveness. This tension produced a government perpetually negotiating with its own principles while confronting a determined and increasingly coordinated adversary. In contrast, the Union, though not without dissent, embraced expanded federal power as essential to survival. The Confederate experience revealed how deeply political philosophy can shape military capability. A nation reluctant to compel unity in pursuit of common objectives faces profound obstacles when engaged in total war. The South's internal fractures, rooted in its devotion to states' rights and compounded by economic and social inequality, limited its ability to marshal resources with the cohesion that modern conflict demanded. At the heart of the Confederacy lay an idea so deeply embedded in its economy, politics, and social order that to question it was to question the entire structure of Southern life. Slavery was not incidental, it was foundational. Cotton fields stretch. Across the Deep South, grand plantations, political power concentrated in the hands of slaveholding elites. All were sustained by the forced labor of millions of enslaved men, women, and children. The Confederacy did not merely tolerate slavery, it was created to protect and perpetuate it. Yet in anchoring itself to human bondage, the South tied its fate to a system that limited its flexibility, constrained its strategy and weakened its standing in a rapidly changing world. The contradiction was stark. Southern leaders spoke eloquently of liberty, of self-government, of resistance to tyranny. They framed secession as a defense of freedom against federal overreach. But the freedom they defended was selective, reserved for white citizens, and depended upon the continued enslavement of others. This moral paradox was not lost on observers at home or abroad. As the war evolved, particularly after the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation by Abraham Lincoln, the Confederacy's cause became inseparable from the preservation of slavery in the eyes of the world. Internationally, this association carried consequences. European powers had abolished slavery and cultivated public identities aligned with abolitionist principles. Even where economic interests encouraged neutrality or quiet sympathy for Southern independence, open support for a slaveholding republic posed political risks. The Confederacy struggled to reconcile its diplomatic ambitions with the moral climate of the mid-19th century. Its defense of slavery isolated it, narrowing potential alliances and reinforcing perceptions that it represented a reactionary order resisting historical progress. Domestically, slavery shaped the Southern war effort in complex and limiting ways. Enslaved labor was central to agricultural production, particularly cotton, which Southern leaders believed would secure for intervention. But dependence on plantation agriculture meant that the South devoted vast tracts of land to cash crops rather than diversified food production. As Union forces advanced and enslaved people fled to Union lines, agricultural output faltered. The labor system that had once generated wealth became unstable under the pressures of war. Plantations lost workers, fields went untended, food shortages grew more severe. The presence of millions of enslaved individuals also influenced military strategy. Southern leaders feared insurrection, especially as Union armies penetrated deeper into Confederate territory. Troops were sometimes diverted to maintain internal security, guarding against the possibility of rebellion. The need to monitor and control the enslaved population constrained the allocation of manpower. While the Union increasingly enlisted black soldiers to strengthen its ranks, the Confederacy hesitated to arm enslaved men, recognizing that such a move would undermine the ideological justification for slavery itself. As the war dragged on and Confederate casualties mounted, debates intensified over whether to enlist enslaved men in exchange for freedom. By 1865, in a measure born of desperation, the Confederate Congress authorized limited enlistment of black soldiers. The proposal struck at the core of Confederate identity. If enslaved men could serve as soldiers, disciplined, armed, and entrusted with responsibility, the premise of racial inferiority that undergirded slavery was exposed as contradiction. The debate revealed the depth of internal division and the extent to which slavery constrained strategic options. The institution also shaped class dynamics within the South. Wealth and political influence were concentrated among slaveholding elites, while many non-slaveholding whites bore the brunt of military service. Policies such as exemptions for certain slaveholders fueled resentment among poorer citizens who questioned whether the war served their interests or primarily protected the wealth of a privileged minority. The defense of slavery thus carried social costs, exacerbating divisions within Confederate society and weakening the unity required for sustained resistance. On plantations and in cities alike, enslaved people themselves became agents in the conflict's outcome. As Union forces approached, thousands seized opportunities to escape. They provided intelligence to Union troops, guided them through unfamiliar terrain, and undermined the labor foundation of the Confederate economy. Their actions were not passive responses, but deliberate assertions of agency. The Confederacy's reliance on coerced labor proved vulnerable when that labor force recognized the shifting tides of war and acted accordingly. Slavery also limited the Confederacy's economic modernization. The plantation system prioritized land and human property over industrial investment. Capital that might have developed factories, railroads, and diversified enterprises was tied up in enslaved labor and agricultural estates. This economic structure, profitable in peacetime under global demand for cotton, left the South less prepared for the industrial demands of prolonged war. The North's diversified economy and manufacturing capacity stood in stark contrast to the Confederacy's dependence on a single export and a rigid labor hierarchy. Ideologically, the Confederacy's explicit defense of slavery narrowed its appeal. While the Union increasingly framed its struggle as one aligned with universal principles of liberty, the South's cause remained tethered to the preservation of bondage. As the war became a contest not only of armies but of ideas, the Confederacy's moral position weakened. The language of freedom, when juxtaposed with the reality of enslavement, rang hollow beyond its most ardent supporters. The contradiction between liberty and slavery was not merely rhetorical, it influenced decision-making at every level. Efforts to adapt, to innovate, to mobilize the full population for war were filtered through the imperative to protect a racial hierarchy. Strategic flexibility was sacrificed to ideological rigidity. The Confederacy fought to preserve a social order that constrained its own evolution, even as the pressures of modern warfare demanded transformation. In building a nation upon the foundation of slavery, the South anchored itself to a system increasingly at odds with global currents and internal necessities. The very institution it sought to defend shaped its economy, divided its society, complicated its diplomacy, restricted its military options, and ultimately bound its fate to a cause that narrowed rather than expanded its capacity to endure the trials of total war. If you found stillness in these words, subscribe to join this space of presence and share you deepest now in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and don't forget to like and subscribe.